and welcome to today's video on the Pilot Signature Nib. Today we're going to be introducing the Pilot Signature Nib, which I have right here. It's the newest nib in Pilot's nib lineup and doing a writing sample with it using our Yoseka Nib Log. Pilot released the Signature Nib in a number 10 size nib on their custom 742 fountain pen model, which is this one right here, back in June of 2022. The Signature Nib became Pilot's 16th type of nib to be available within the Pilot custom collection. For those of you who don't know, Pilot's custom collection of pens consists of 8 different models of pens available with a really wide range of 16 different types of nibs. And as the name custom suggests, Pilot's idea for their custom lineup is basically essentially a personalized pen with so many nib options available on various pen models that anyone can basically find a pen that is customized to their liking and preferences, whether they like to write big or small, English or Western characters, whether they like to use fine paper or thick paper, fountain pen friendly paper or not fountain pen friendly paper. And according to the Pilot website, the Signature Nib is best suited for, quote, lettering with very bold downstrokes and medium strokes, and it lends itself well to adding flourishes to writing. As its name suggests, it's also meant to make someone's signature very beautiful, and it follows that in general, it makes most cursive writing more beautiful. Among fountain pen users today, the Signature Nib is often compared to a stub nib, but it's more rounded. It has a more rounded tipping, so it's a bit easier to write with. So let's take a closer look at the Signature Nib, the actual nib itself, versus a traditional stub nib and just kind of identify some of the differences. And then we're going to proceed with a writing sample using our nib log and just a general writing sample to see what the Signature Nib actually writes like. Okay, everybody, so this is the Pilot Custom 742 fountain pen. It looks a lot like other Pilot fountain pens, and I'm not going to spend too much time on the barrel, but the nib is a Signature Nib. It is the number 10 Pilot nib with a Signature nib, and I have also here a Kaweco Sport with a very thick calligraphy stub nib. This is a 2.3 millimeter stub nib, just so that you can see like what a really exaggerated version of a stub nib looks like. So let's take a little bit of a closer look to see these nibs. So you can see here that a stub nib is basically a regular fountain pen nib, but the tipping, which usually comes to a tip or a ball, it looks like it's kind of been ground down into this very flat tip here. And on the left here is the Pilot Signature Nib with similar characteristics. It's not as dramatic of a stub nib as the stub here, 2.3 millimeter, but it is you can see it has a little bit of a flat tip at the tipping. That is what gives the pen kind of these calligraphic strokes, and the difference between the downstroke and the cross stroke, that's what makes the line width between the cross stroke and the downstroke so different. So then we're going to turn these nibs on their sides here and take a look at the actual shape of the tip of these two fountain pens. So on the right here is the Kaweco stub nib, and you can see that the tipping is pretty much completely flat. It is completely flat, ground down, super flat. It's almost like, you know, you can almost see completely through to the other side. Versus the tipping on the left pen here, the nib on the left is the Signature Nib, the Pilot Signature Nib, and the tipping on the Signature Nib is more ball-like. So you can see this little like ball-like protrusion. So that's what makes the Signature Nib kind of unique, is that it has the characteristics of these wide tines, which make it sort of stub-like, but when you actually look at the shape of the tipping itself, it is a ball still. So now that we've looked at the shape of the Pilot Signature Nib versus the Kaweco Stub Nib, we're gonna actually do a little writing sample with the Signature Nib and see how it writes differently from any other fountain pen nib. I have our nib log here, and I'm just going to start writing with the Pilot Signature Nib and see how it does. So Pilot actually says that you are meant to write with this nib on a 45-degree angle, but instead of holding the nib very straight against the paper, you're kind of supposed to tilt it a little bit like this. And what that means is you're supposed to write almost like it's an italic, so a little bit on the side, which gives it more of those flourishes that are really brought out by this kind of stubby nib shape. So let's take a look. We don't know the line width yet. Okay, so let's take a look at the the vertical strokes versus the cross strokes here. So these are the down strokes, the vertical strokes, and the horizontal strokes, the cross strokes. So according to Pilot, what they mean by the very bold downstrokes and the medium cross strokes is that the line width of the downstroke here is almost like a double broad pen, and the horizontal stroke or cross stroke going across there is closer to a medium nib. And I think I would agree with that, in that it is a very thick and wet downstroke and a slightly thinner cross stroke going across, but it's not like a very huge difference like you would expect with a traditional stub nib. Yeah, so there you go. Let me look at the wetness over here. This is a particularly wet, this is feeling very wet to me. We're gonna color this in. Yeah, and it's got quite some drag on it here. Softness testing wise, we're going to do a downstroke with no pressure, and a downstroke with some pressure, a downstroke with no pressure, and a downstroke with more pressure, and then a downstroke with no pressure, and a downstroke with a lot of pressure. And you can see here that there is definitely, it is soft, it's a soft nib, it's a gold nib, which obviously lends itself to softness. But the difference is not super dramatic here. And there's actually almost no difference between a little pressure applied and a lot of pressure applied. That's not really super surprising at all, because this is not supposed to be a flex nib at all. So yeah, it does have a little bit of softness and it has a little bit of give to it when you apply pressure, but nothing crazy. Okay, so let's do the line width here. Okay, so you can see here, I've done the line comparison and I have done it for writing on 2 different strokes. So the cross stroke with the nib being held exactly across, and then the downstroke with the nib being kind of turned to the side and dragged across the page for that thicker stroke. And we've determined using our nib log that the downstroke produces a thicker line width of 0.8 millimeters, and the cross stroke produces the thinner line width of 0.4 millimeters. Okay, so that was the line width analysis and just a little bit of a writing sample with the nib log. And for the signature nib, I've actually also prepared an additional little writing sample. So here on the left, I've prepared a little writing sample with the Pilot Signature Nib, just in more cursive, and I've written Pilot Signature Nib, and on the right here I've compared with a Sailor 14 karat broad nib, just to kind of see what the actual difference is when you're writing something in cursive in these two different nibs. So I think the main line that I'll draw your attention to here is this one here, where I've written Yoseka Stationery. It's kind of like Yoseka Signature in cursive, and I've written it on the oblique angle, like on the angle that I was demonstrating before, using sort of like italic, so turning the nib to the side as Pilot suggests that we do with this nib. And you can see here that here you get some thin strokes as well as a combination of some thin strokes with some thicker strokes when you're using the fountain pen nib on the oblique angle there. So right away you can kind of see that this does definitely have, when written with a signature nib, this line definitely does have more character and what Pilot calls more flourish, more embellishment to it when compared to just a standard nib. And that really comes from the difference between those downstrokes versus the cross strokes. So you can see here that the downstrokes and the cross strokes, there is that difference, like that double broad versus medium, versus if you're using a standard fountain pen nib, you get pretty equal downstrokes versus cross strokes. There's like no line variation there whatsoever. And so it does create this more, I guess, like monotonous signature where all the lines are pretty equal line width dimensions, versus this one where you're kind of getting different strokes, and you can see because it's a shading ink, you have more dynamic colors in that line. So that is really where the Pilot Signature Nib stands out, I will say. And I have to agree that Pilot's done a good job creating a nib that is kind of like a stub nib, but not exactly like a stub nib. Okay, so there you have it, the Pilot Signature Nib. This nib is currently only available on 2 fountain pens, the 742, which I have right here, and I did today's line comparison with. It has the number 10 nib, and the custom 823 with the slightly larger number 15 nib. In my opinion, this nib is a lot easier to write with than a stub nib, which can sometimes be finicky and hard start on you depending on the angle that you're holding it at. I always say that music and stub nibs take a little getting used to, but with the signature nib, because it has that more rounded tipping, it's more like a standard fountain pen, so it's easier to just pick it up and write with it right off the bat. So that's my 2 cents on the signature nib. I hope you enjoyed this video and got some understanding of what a Pilot Signature Nib writes like. Let us know if you have any questions in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching. Bye!